Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The paradox of thrift. Saving money is virtuous, or so conventional wisdom holds. The careful individual who sets aside a portion of income, who resists the temptation to spend frivolously, who builds reserves against uncertain futures, is praised for responsibility and prudence. And yet there exists a paradox, articulated by economists and popularized by John Maynard Keynes, which suggests that if everyone tries to save more at the same time, the collective result is not increased wealth but decreased income, not prosperity but recession. And this is the paradox of thrift, a situation where individually rational behavior leads to collectively irrational outcomes, where virtue practiced universally becomes vice. The mechanism of the paradox operates through the relationship between spending and income in an economy, because one person's spending is another person's income. When you buy goods or services, you transfer money to the seller, who uses that money to pay employees and suppliers, who in turn spend it on other goods and services. And this circular flow of spending sustains employment and production. And if many people simultaneously decide to save more and spend less, then aggregate demand falls, businesses see reduced sales and respond by cutting production and laying off workers. And those who lose jobs or see reduced hours have less income, which forces them to reduce spending further, which causes more businesses to cut back. And this feedback loop drives the economy into recession. And in the recession, people earn less income, which means that despite their desire to save more, they may end up saving the same amount or even less than before, because their incomes have fallen. And so the collective attempt to increase savings fails, defeated by the macroeconomic dynamics it sets in motion. The paradox challenges the microeconomic intuition that saving is always beneficial, that thrift is a virtue without qualification, and it reveals a divergence between individual rationality and collective welfare, a situation where what is good for each person taken separately is bad for everyone taken together. And this kind of divergence appears throughout economics, in the tragedy of the commons where individual overuse of shared resources leads to collective depletion, in the prisoner's dilemma where individual defection leads to mutually harmful outcomes, and in coordination failures where the inability to synchronize actions produces inefficiency. Keynes used the paradox of thrift to argue for government intervention during economic downturns, suggesting that when private sector spending collapses, the government should step in and increase public spending, running deficits if necessary to maintain aggregate demand and prevent the economy from spiraling into depression. And this idea became a cornerstone of Keynesian economics, influencing policy responses to recessions for decades, though it remains controversial, with critics arguing that government spending is inefficient, that deficits impose costs on future generations, that markets are self-correcting and will eventually restore full employment without intervention, and that the paradox of thrift does not apply in the long run because savings finance investment, which increases productive capacity and future income. The debate over the paradox of thrift touches on fundamental questions about how economies function, whether they are naturally stable or prone to instability, whether markets can coordinate the actions of millions of individuals efficiently, or whether coordination failures are common and require correction, and whether the behavior that is rational for individuals is also rational for society, or whether there are systematic conflicts between private incentives and public welfare. The paradox also raises ethical and philosophical issues, because if individual virtue can produce collective harm, then the relationship between ethics and outcomes becomes more complex. The action that seems right from a personal perspective may contribute to suffering when widely practiced. And this suggests that moral evaluation cannot focus solely on individual actions, but must also consider systemic effects, the ways that individual choices aggregate into social outcomes, and whether there are actions that are permissible or even obligatory for individuals, but disastrous if universally adopted. The paradox of thrift connects to issues of time preference and uncertainty, because saving reflects a preference for future consumption over present consumption, a willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future security. And this preference varies across individuals and across time, influenced by expectations about the future, by confidence in economic stability, by the availability of social insurance and safety nets. And when uncertainty increases, people tend to save more as a precaution. And this precautionary saving can trigger the paradox, can cause the very economic instability that people are trying to protect themselves against, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of recession causes recession. The paradox also appears in the context of debt and deleveraging. When households or firms carry high levels of debt, they may all try to reduce their debt burdens simultaneously by saving more and spending less. And this collective deleveraging reduces aggregate demand and can cause a debt deflation spiral where falling prices and incomes make debt burdens even harder to service, leading to defaults and further economic contraction. And this dynamic was central to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008, periods when the paradox of thrift was not merely a theoretical curiosity, but a lived reality affecting millions of people. Some economists question whether the paradox is genuine or whether it reflects a misunderstanding of economic dynamics, arguing that savings do not disappear from the economy but are channeled into investment. That when people save more, banks have more funds to lend to businesses for productive investments. And these investments create jobs and income. And so in the long run, increased saving leads to increased capital accumulation and higher living standards. And the paradox only appears in the short run, when there is a coordination problem, when the financial system fails to efficiently convert savings into investment, or when there is a liquidity trap where interest rates are already at zero and cannot fall further to stimulate investment. The paradox of thrift remains a central concept in macroeconomics, a reminder that economies are complex systems where individual actions interact in non-obvious ways, where feedback loops and emergent properties can produce outcomes that no one intended or desired, and where the aggregation of individual rationality does not necessarily produce collective rationality. And it stands as a challenge to simplistic economic thinking, to the idea that what is good for one is good for all, to the belief that markets automatically harmonize individual interests with social welfare, and it forces recognition that economic policy cannot be based solely on microeconomic principles, that understanding the economy requires attention to aggregate demand, to expectations and confidence, to the circular flow of income and spending, and to the possibility that individually prudent behavior can, under certain conditions, create collective disaster. And the paradox lingers as a warning that virtue is context-dependent, that actions are not good or bad in themselves, but only in relation to the circumstances in which they occur and the effects they produce, and that the attempt to secure individual futures through increased saving can, paradoxically, undermine those futures by damaging the economy on which everyone depends. The paradox of the court, when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case, and the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition. And second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case. And according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case. And so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay, and second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case, and according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case, and so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment, and this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable, not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay, and these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce, and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere. And this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction, and impossible contracts are unenforceable, and so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy, and the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction. The potato paradox. A farmer harvests 100 kilograms of potatoes, and these potatoes are 99% water by weight, meaning that only 1 kilogram is solid potato material and 99 kilograms is water. And the farmer leaves the potatoes out in the sun to dry, and after some time the water content has decreased. The potatoes are now 98% water instead of 99%. And the question is posed, how much do the potatoes weigh now? And the intuitive answer is that they have lost a little water, perhaps 1 kilogram, and so they now weigh 99 kilograms, or perhaps 98 kilograms. But this intuition is wildly wrong. The correct answer is that the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. They have lost half their weight, and this shocking result is the potato paradox, a puzzle about percentages and proportions that reveals how badly human intuition handles these concepts. The calculation proceeds as follows. The solid potato material, the non-water part, weighs 1 kilogram both before and after drying. This does not change. The potatoes lose water, but not solid material. And before drying, this 1 kilogram of solid material represents 1% of the total weight, because the potatoes are 99% water and 1% solid. And after drying, this same 1 kilogram of solid material must represent 2% of the total weight, because the potatoes are now 98% water and therefore 2% solid. And if 1 kilogram is 2% of the total weight, then the total weight must be 50 kilograms, because 1 kilogram divided by 2% equals 50 kilograms. And so the potatoes have lost 50 kilograms of water, going from 100 kilograms to 50 kilograms, even though the percentage of water has decreased by only 1 percentage point, from 99% to 98%. The paradox reveals how deceptive percentages can be, how a small change in percentage can correspond to a large change in absolute quantity, and the confusion arises from conflating different reference points. The percentage of water is calculated relative to the total weight, which itself changes as water is lost. And so the meaning of 99% water before drying is different from the meaning of 98% water after drying, because the total weight is different. And this shifting reference point makes the percentage decrease seem small when in fact it corresponds to a massive, absolute loss of water. Another way to see the solution is to focus on the solid material. Before drying, the ratio of water to solid is 99:1, and after drying the ratio is 98:2, which simplifies to 49:1. And since the solid material remains 1 kilogram throughout, the water content must be 49 kilograms after drying, giving a total weight of 50 kilograms. And this calculation makes clear that the ratio of water to solid has nearly halved, from 99 parts water per part solid to 49 parts water per part solid. And this large change in ratio corresponds to the loss of half the total weight. The potato paradox has analogues in many real-world contexts where percentages and proportions are used. In economics, where small percentage changes in large quantities can represent enormous absolute changes. In medicine, where changes in concentrations or doses must be carefully calculated to avoid errors. In environmental science, where changes in atmospheric composition are measured in parts per million but can have large effects. And in all these contexts, the potato paradox serves as a warning that percentage changes can be misleading, that absolute quantities matter, and that careful calculation is necessary to avoid errors. The paradox also illustrates a general principle about proportions, that when the total changes, percentages relative to that total change in non-obvious ways, and that converting between percentages and absolute quantities requires attention to what the percentage is calculated relative to, and failure to track the denominator, failure to notice that the reference point is shifting, leads to systematic errors in reasoning, errors that the potato paradox exemplifies. Some people respond to the potato paradox by rejecting the premise, by arguing that potatoes cannot go from 99% water to 98% water by drying, that the numbers are unrealistic, but this response misses the point. The paradox is a thought experiment designed to illustrate mathematical relationships, and while the specific numbers may be exaggerated for effect, the underlying principle is sound, and similar calculations arise in realistic scenarios involving concentrations, dilutions, evaporations, and mixing, and understanding the potato paradox helps avoid errors in these practical contexts. The paradox is also pedagogically valuable. It is often used to teach proportional reasoning, to help students understand the difference between absolute and relative quantities, to emphasize the importance of identifying what a percentage is calculated relative to, and to show that intuition about percentages is often wrong, that careful calculation is necessary, and that problems involving changing totals require extra care. And students who master the potato paradox gain insight into a whole class of problems involving ratios, proportions, and percentages, problems that appear throughout mathematics, science, economics, and everyday life. The 100 kilograms of potatoes sit in the sun, water evaporating, and the percentage of water drops from 99 to 98. A change that sounds small, that feels negligible, and yet the weight has halved. 50 kilograms of water have disappeared, and the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. And this result shocks, violates expectation, reveals the gap between how percentages sound and what they mean, and the paradox endures, a simple problem with a surprising answer, a calculation that seems wrong but is right, a demonstration that percentages are tricky, that proportions shift in non-obvious ways, and that human intuition about these matters is unreliable, needs correction, needs training, needs the discipline of mathematics to avoid systematic error. And the paradox remains, taught in classrooms, discussed in puzzles, a permanent reminder that numbers are subtle, that context matters, that reference points shift, and that the gap between 99% and 98%, which sounds like 1%, can actually represent 50% of the total. And the potatoes shrink, the water evaporates, and the weight drops, and the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a lesson in proportional reasoning wrapped in a story about potatoes and sunshine. The phantom limb. Paradox, why missing body parts still feel present. A soldier loses an arm in combat. The limb is amputated, no longer exists, no longer is connected to the body, and yet the soldier feels the arm, feels it present, feels sensations in fingers that are not there, feels the arm moving, feels it itching, feels pain in the missing hand. And this sensation is vivid, is compelling, is indistinguishable from sensations in real limbs. And this is the phantom limb phenomenon experienced by the vast majority of amputees, where missing body parts continue to be felt, continue to be represented in consciousness. And the paradox is that the brain maintains a representation of a limb that no longer exists, continues to generate sensations attributed to that limb, continues to include it in the body schema, despite clear evidence from vision and from direct inspection that the limb is absent. And this persistence reveals something deep about how the brain constructs body representations, shows that body schemas are not simply reflections of current physical structure, but are neural constructs that can outlive the body parts they represent. And phantom limbs demonstrate that the sense of embodiment is generated centrally, is maintained by brain processes that do not require peripheral input. And the phenomenon raises questions about the relationship between body and brain, about how sensations are localized, about what it means for a body part to be yours when that part no longer exists. Imagine the experience from the inside. You lost your hand months ago. The physical hand is gone, and yet you feel it. Feel the fingers, can feel yourself making a fist, opening the hand, moving fingers that are not there. And these phantom movements feel exactly like real movements, involve the same motor intentions, the same kinesthetic sensations. And sometimes the phantom hand is in uncomfortable positions, cramped or twisted, and you cannot move it, cannot relieve the discomfort. And this frozen phantom is intensely frustrating, is painful, because you feel the limb but cannot control it, cannot adjust it, and the pain is real, is neurological, is generated by the brain but is felt as coming from the missing hand. And this localization is puzzling because there is no hand, no physical location where the sensations could be occurring, and yet the sensations are localized there, are felt as arising from a specific spatial location that happens to be empty. The phantom limb phenomenon reveals that body representations are maintained in the somatosensory cortex, in the motor cortex, in the parietal lobe, and these representations do not simply disappear when a limb is removed, do not automatically update to reflect the new body configuration, and instead the neural circuitry that represented the limb continues to be active, continues to generate activity patterns that are interpreted as sensations in the missing limb, and this persistent activity is what creates phantom sensations, is what maintains the feeling of presence and understanding. This has led to treatments, has led to therapies that attempt to reorganize the somatosensory cortex, to reduce phantom pain by providing feedback that the limb is gone, and mirror therapy, where amputees use mirrors to create the visual illusion that the missing limb is present, has proven effective, helps reduce pain and unfreeze frozen phantoms by providing visual feedback that allows the brain to update its body representation. Visualize the somatosensory cortex as containing a map of the body, a homunculus where different regions represent different body parts, and this map is established during development, is maintained throughout life, and when a limb is amputated, the corresponding region of cortex does not simply go silent, does not become inactive, and instead neighbouring regions begin to invade, begin to colonize the deferented cortex, and inputs from the face or from the remaining arm begin to activate what was formerly hand cortex. And this reorganization is rapid, occurs within weeks and creates strange effects. Touching the face can produce sensations in the phantom hand, stroking the cheek can feel like stroking the missing fingers, and this shows that the cortical representation has been invaded, that face inputs now activate hand cortex, and the sensations are still localized to the phantom because the activity occurs in hand cortex, and the brain interprets activity in hand cortex as indicating sensations in the hand regardless of the actual source of the activity. The phantom limb paradox challenges the idea that sensations are simply caused by peripheral stimulation, shows that sensations can be generated centrally, can arise from brain activity without corresponding peripheral events, and this has implications for understanding pain, for recognizing that pain is not simply a signal from damaged tissue, but is a constructed experience that can occur without tissue damage, and chronic pain. Phantom pain, neuropathic pain are all examples of centrally generated sensations, are pains that arise from neural processes rather than from peripheral injury. And understanding phantom limbs helps understand these pain conditions, helps develop treatments that target the central nervous system rather than the periphery. The phenomenon also raises philosophical questions about the extended mind, about whether the body is part of the mind or is merely a tool used by the mind, and phantom limbs suggest that the body representation is part of the mind, is a core component of self-representation, and the representation persists even when the body part is gone. And this shows that the mind includes representations of the body, includes body schemas that are not simply passive reflections of physical structure, but are active constructs that shape experience. And the phantom limb is a representation without a referent, is a body part in the mind, but not in the world. And this dissociation shows that minds represent bodies, and representations can outlive what they represent. One variant of phantom limbs occurs in congenital amputees, people born without limbs, and some congenitally limbless individuals report phantom limbs, report feeling limbs they never had. And this is surprising, suggests that body schemas are not entirely learned, are not simply acquired through experience with actual body parts, but have some innate component, are partly specified by genetic programs that establish expected body structure. And when these programs run, they generate representations of limbs, even when those limbs never existed. And this shows that body schemas are not simply empirical generalizations from sensory experience, but are structured expectations about what bodies should be like. And the brain generates these representations even in the absence of corresponding body parts. Another implication concerns prosthetics, because if phantom limbs persist, if amputees continue to feel missing limbs, then prosthetics should be designed to interface with these phantom sensations, should provide feedback that is integrated with the phantom, and neuroprosthetics that read motor intentions from the brain or from remaining nerves can be controlled by the phantom, can allow amputees to move prosthetic limbs by moving their phantom limbs. And this creates a seamless interface, allows natural control, and the phantom limb, rather than being a problem, becomes a solution, becomes the interface between brain and prosthetic. And understanding phantoms has been crucial for developing advanced prosthetics that feel natural, that are experienced as extensions of the body rather than as external tools. The phantom also appears in other contexts: phantom breasts after mastectomy, phantom genitalia after surgery, phantom teeth after extraction, and all these phantoms reflect the same underlying mechanism, the persistence of neural representations after the represented body parts are removed, and the generality of the phenomenon shows that it is not specific to limbs but applies to any body part, and body schemas for all body parts can persist as phantoms. And this universality suggests that phantoms reveal a general principle about how brains construct body representations, how these representations are maintained centrally, and how they can become dissociated from physical reality. The amputee feels the hand, phantom fingers that are not there, phantom movements that cannot occur, phantom pain in a location that does not exist, and the paradox persists. The brain maintains a representation despite the absence of the represented, and phantom limbs reveal that bodies are represented in brains, that these representations are stable, are resistant to updating, are constructed during development and maintained throughout life, and removal of body parts does not remove their representations, and the phantom remains, felt but not present, localized but not located, moving but motionless, and the paradox endures as one of the most striking phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that consciousness includes representations that can outlive their reference, that sensations can be generated centrally without peripheral causes, and that the body we feel is not simply the body we have, but is the body the brain represents. And sometimes these diverge and phantoms emerge, ghostly presences of absent limbs, and the phenomenon persists. The paradox of democracy, when majority rule destroys itself. A democratic society values freedom and equality, gives every citizen voice, allows majority rule to determine policy, and this seems just, seems fair, seems like the best system for governance. And yet democracy contains internal tensions, contains paradoxes that threaten its stability, and one fundamental paradox asks, what democracy should do when the majority votes to end democracy? When the people use democratic procedures to elect authoritarian leaders who promise to dismantle democratic institutions? And if democracy respects majority, will it must allow this outcome, must permit its own destruction? But if democracy forbids this outcome, prevents the majority from choosing authoritarianism, then it violates its own principles, acts undemocratically. And this is the paradox of democracy, the recognition that democracy's commitment to majority rule can lead to outcomes that destroy democracy itself. And navigating this paradox requires balancing competing values, requires defending democracy sometimes against democratic procedures, requires recognizing that procedural democracy is not sufficient, that substantive commitments to rights and freedoms are necessary to preserve democracy. And this paradox has been central to political philosophy since ancient times, was recognized by Plato, who argued that democracy tends toward tyranny, and the paradox remains relevant today as democratic societies face authoritarian movements that use democratic means to gain power. Imagine an election where an authoritarian party campaigns on promises to restrict freedoms, to eliminate checks and balances, to concentrate power, to end future elections, and this party wins a majority, wins through legitimate democratic procedures, through free and fair voting, and now the society faces a choice. Honour the election results and allow democracy to be dismantled, or override the results and preserve democracy by undemocratic means. And neither option is satisfactory. Both involve betraying core democratic values. And the paradox emerges from the fact that democracy values both procedural fairness and substantive freedoms. And these can conflict. Majority can threaten minority rights, can threaten the institutions that make democracy possible. And when conflict occurs, democracy faces an impossible choice. Preserve procedure or preserve substance. Respect majority will or defend fundamental freedoms. The paradox connects to Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, that tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive, and the same structure applies to democracy. Unlimited democracy, democracy that respects all majority decisions regardless of content, leads to the disappearance of democracy, and democratic societies must be undemocratic toward anti-democratic movements to preserve democracy, and this creates the paradox. Democracy must violate its principles to preserve its principles, must act undemocratically to remain democratic. And this tension is permanent, is inherent in the structure of democracy, cannot be fully resolved, but must be managed through careful balancing of competing considerations. Visualize democracy as having two aspects: procedural democracy, which emphasizes voting, majority rule, fair elections, and substantive democracy, which emphasizes rights, freedoms, protections for minorities, and ideally these aspects reinforce each other. Procedures protect rights and rights enable procedures, but they can conflict. Procedures can be used to undermine rights, majorities can vote to restrict freedoms, and when conflict occurs, the society must choose which aspect to prioritize, and different societies make different choices. Constitutional democracies emphasize substantive protections, have constitutions that limit majority power, protect fundamental rights even against majority will, and these systems accept that democracy involves more than majority rule, involves commitments to principles that cannot be overridden by votes. And this resolves the paradox partially, makes democracy less purely procedural, more substantively constrained. One response to the paradox argues that true democracy is substantive, not procedural, that democracy is not just about voting, but about respecting rights, protecting minorities, ensuring freedom. And when these substantive commitments are threatened, even by majority vote, democracy requires defending them, requires overriding the majority, and this militant democracy, this democracy that defends itself against anti-democratic forces, is not a betrayal of democracy, but is its preservation, is necessary to maintain the conditions that make democracy possible. And historical examples support this. Societies that failed to restrict anti-democratic movements, that allowed authoritarians to use democratic procedures to gain power, lost their democracies, and hindsight suggests that early intervention, that militant defense would have been justified, would have preserved democracy even though it involved undemocratic means. Another response distinguishes between procedural rules and constitutional principles, argues that democracies should have entrenched principles that cannot be changed by ordinary procedures, that require supermajorities or constitutional amendments, and these entrenched principles include fundamental rights, democratic structures, and protections for minorities. And ordinary majorities can make policy within these constraints, but cannot override the principles themselves. And this response preserves both procedural and substantive democracy, allows majority rule within limits, and the paradox is resolved by recognizing that democracy is hierarchical, has constitutional principles at one level and democratic procedures at another, and procedures operate within the framework set by principles, and this framework is not itself subject to ordinary democratic revision. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that democracy is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable to self-destruction, and argues that this vulnerability is a price worth paying for freedom, that the alternative, restricting democracy to protect democracy, is worse than the risk of democratic collapse. And this radical democratic response trusts in the people, trusts that majorities will not choose their own oppression, and when they do, the society pays the price. And this response is rare. Most societies are unwilling to risk democratic collapse, prefer to impose constraints on democracy, but the response represents one coherent position, one way of resolving the paradox by accepting its consequences. The paradox also appears in debates about hate speech, about whether democracies should allow speech that advocates for the destruction of democracy, speech that promotes authoritarianism or discrimination. And free speech is a democratic value, is protected in democratic societies. But speech that aims to destroy democracy creates the paradox, and banning such speech seems undemocratic, seems to violate free expression, but allowing it risks democracy's survival. And different democracies resolve this differently. Some ban anti-democratic speech, some allow it, and no resolution is without costs. All involve trade-offs between competing values. The election results are counted, the authoritarian party has won, and the democratic society faces the paradox: honour the results and risk losing democracy, or override the results and betray democratic procedures. And the choice is not theoretical, is faced by real societies, has been faced throughout history, and different societies have chosen differently. Some have preserved democracy by undemocratic means, some have respected procedures and lost democracy, and the paradox remains unresolved, remains a permanent tension in democratic governance, a challenge that every democracy must navigate, must balance procedure against substance, must defend itself without betraying itself. And the paradox of democracy endures as a fundamental problem in political philosophy, a recognition that democracy contains contradictions, that majority rule can lead to minority oppression, that freedom can be voted away, and that preserving democracy sometimes requires limiting democracy. And the tension persists. The balance is delicate, and the paradox remains unsolved, a permanent feature of democratic life. The paradox of free will: why choice seems both real and impossible. A person stands at a crossroads, two paths diverging, and must choose which way to go. And the person deliberates, weighs options, considers consequences, and makes a decision, chooses one path. And this choosing feels free, feels like the person could have chosen otherwise, like the decision was truly up to them, genuinely within their control. And yet the person's decision is the result of brain processes, is caused by prior states of neurons, by chemical reactions, by electrical signals, and these processes are themselves caused by earlier states, by genetics and experience and current circumstances. And the chain of causation extends back through the person's life, through evolution, through the physical history of the universe. And at no point in this causal chain is there a break, a moment where cause gives way to free choice, where determinism is suspended. And if every event has causes, if the present is determined by the past plus the laws of physics, then the person's decision was determined long before the moment of choosing, was inevitable given prior conditions. And the feeling of free choice is an illusion. The decision was never really up to the person, could not have been otherwise. And this creates the paradox of free will, the apparent incompatibility between the subjective experience of freedom and the objective reality of causal determination, between the feeling that we choose and the fact that our choices are caused. And this paradox has troubled philosophers for millennia, generated enormous literature, produced multiple attempted solutions, but never achieved consensus. And the problem persists as one of the central questions in philosophy, ethics, and the nature of human agency. Imagine the person's brain at the moment of decision, neurons firing in specific patterns, dopamine and serotonin modulating activity, and these patterns cause the decision, determine which path is chosen, and the patterns themselves were caused by prior brain states, by sensory inputs, by memories activated, by emotional states, and these prior states had their own causes, and the causal chain is unbroken, and nowhere in this chain is there room for free will, for choices that are not caused, for decisions that could have been different given exactly the same prior conditions. And if determinism is true, if the laws of physics determine everything, then free will seems impossible, seems to be a conceptual confusion, And yet the feeling of freedom persists, and we hold people responsible for their actions, praise and blame them, treat them as if their choices were free, and the legal system, morality, social practices all assume free will, assume that people could have done otherwise. And the paradox is that free will seems both necessary for responsibility and impossible given causation. The paradox generates three main positions: compatibilism, which says free will is compatible with determinism, incompatibilism, which says they are incompatible, and libertarianism, not political libertarianism, but metaphysical libertarianism, which accepts incompatibility and argues that determinism is false, that humans have genuine free will, and different philosophers defend each position with different arguments, and no consensus emerges, and the debate continues, and the paradox remains unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable, and this might reflect a deep feature of human existence, that we cannot escape the feeling of freedom even if we become convinced intellectually that freedom is impossible, that the first-person perspective of deliberation requires treating ourselves as free even if the third-person perspective of science shows that we are determined. Visualize determinism as a timeline. The state of the universe at one time, plus the laws of physics, determines the state at the next time. And this determination is complete, includes everything, includes brain states and decisions, and the timeline is like a film that has already been recorded, and we are living through it, experiencing events as they unfold. But the sequence is fixed, was fixed by initial conditions billions of years ago, and our decisions are frames in this film, are determined by previous frames. And no alternative timeline is possible given the initial conditions and the laws. And if this picture is correct, then the feeling of having options, of being able to choose differently, is illusory. We could not have chosen differently. The decision was already encoded in the prior state of the universe, and we are not free. Compatibilists respond that this picture misunderstands what free will requires, that free will does not require the ability to have chosen differently given exactly the same prior conditions, does not require breaking the causal chain, but only requires that our choices flow from our own desires, values, character, that we are not coerced, not forced, not manipulated, and as long as the person's decision resulted from their own deliberation, their own reasons, they acted freely, even though their deliberation was caused, even though their reasons were determined. And free will is compatible with determinism because free will is about the source of action, about whether it comes from the agent's own psychology, not about whether it is uncaused. Incompatibilists reject compatibilism, argue that if determinism is true, then everything we do was determined by factors beyond our control, by genetics we did not choose, by environments we did not create, by causal chains that began before we were born, and we are not genuinely responsible for actions that were determined by factors beyond our control. And compatibilist free will is not real freedom, but is a verbal trick, is redefining freedom to make it compatible with determinism, and genuine freedom, the kind required for moral responsibility, requires that we could have done otherwise, requires that our choices are not determined. And since determinism is probably true, given physics, genuine free will probably does not exist, and moral responsibility is problematic. Libertarians argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics shows that the universe is not deterministic, that there is genuine randomness, genuine indeterminacy at the quantum level, and this indeterminacy allows for free will, allows for choices that are not determined by prior states. But critics respond that randomness is not freedom, that random neural processes do not give us control over our actions, do not make us responsible, and adding randomness to determinism does not create free will, creates only determinism plus chance, and neither determination nor chance gives us the control required for responsibility. The paradox of free will also has practical implications for criminal justice, for morality, for how we treat each other, Because if free will is an illusion, then punishment seems unjustified, seems cruel, and blame seems inappropriate, and we should respond to harmful behavior with rehabilitation or prevention rather than retribution. And yet the practice of holding people responsible seems essential to social life, seems unavoidable even if philosophically problematic. And we continue to blame and praise, punish and reward, as if free will exists, and perhaps this is necessary. Perhaps human social life requires treating people as responsible, even if the metaphysical foundations are shaky. The person stands at the crossroads, deliberates, chooses, and walks down one path, and whether this choice was free remains disputed, remains one of philosophy's hardest questions, and the paradox endures. Free will seems both essential and impossible, both real and illusory, and the tension between these perspectives remains unresolved, and perhaps the tension is permanent, is a feature of human existence that cannot be eliminated, that we must live with the subjective feeling of freedom while recognizing the objective reality of causation, and the paradox of free will persists as a permanent puzzle about human agency, about responsibility, about whether we are authors of our actions or merely characters in a predetermined story. And the question remains open, continues to generate debate, continues to matter for ethics and law and self-understanding. And the crossroads remains, the paths diverge, the choice is made, and whether it was truly free remains one of philosophy's deepest and most enduring questions. The paradox of choice, why having everything makes us want nothing. A shopper stands in the cereal aisle of a modern supermarket, surrounded by hundreds of options, dozens of brands, each offering multiple varieties, chocolate cereals and fruit cereals and granola and organic options and sugar-free options and high-fiber options. And the shopper came with a simple goal, to buy cereal, but now faces a wall of choices, and minutes pass. Then more minutes, as the shopper reads labels, compares prices, weighs nutritional content against taste preferences, and the simple task becomes exhausting, becomes overwhelming, and eventually the shopper either picks something randomly just to escape the aisle, or leaves without buying anything at all, paralyzed by too many options. And this is the paradox of choice, articulated by psychologist Barry Schwartz. The observation that while having some choice is better than having none, having too many choices can actually make us worse off, can lead to decision paralysis, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and regret. And this paradox challenges the assumption that more freedom and more options always lead to better outcomes, suggests instead that there is an optimal amount of choice beyond which additional options become burdensome rather than beneficial. Imagine living in a world with few choices, a small village where there is one type of bread, one kind of shoe, limited options for occupation and lifestyle, and people generally wear what everyone wears, eat what everyone eats, follow the paths that tradition provides. And this limited choice can feel constraining, can prevent people from finding what truly suits them, can force them into roles and lifestyles that do not fit, but it also simplifies life, reduces the cognitive burden of decision-making, provides clear social scripts and expectations, and people in such societies often report high satisfaction because expectations are managed, because the gap between what they have and what they could have is small. And now contrast this with modern, affluent societies where choice proliferates endlessly, where every decision, from what to eat for breakfast to what career to pursue, involves navigating vast option spaces. And while this freedom allows for personalization, allows people to find exactly what they want, it also creates anxiety, creates the constant question of whether a better option exists, whether the choice made was optimal. And this anxiety erodes satisfaction even when the chosen option is good, because the existence of unchosen alternatives haunts the decision. The paradox operates through several psychological mechanisms. First is decision paralysis. When faced with too many options, the cognitive load of evaluating them becomes overwhelming. And rather than carefully comparing all options, People either make hasty decisions to escape the complexity or defer the decision entirely, avoid choosing at all, and this is why offering more product varieties can sometimes decrease sales. Why adding options can reduce rather than increase engagement, because each additional option adds to the burden of decision making, and at some point the burden exceeds the benefit and people opt out. Second is regret and second guessing. When there are many options and you choose one, the existence of all the unchosen options creates opportunity for regret, creates the thought that perhaps one of the other options would have been better, and this regret is stronger when there are more alternatives because each alternative represents a path not taken, a potential source of better outcomes. And so the chosen option must compete not just with reality, but with imagination, with idealized versions of what the unchosen options might have provided, and actual outcomes rarely exceed these idealized counterfactuals. And so satisfaction decreases even when the choice is good, and this effect is amplified when choices are reversible, when you can change your mind, because reversibility keeps all options perpetually open, prevents commitment, prevents the psychological closure that comes from accepting a decision as final. Third is the escalation of expectations. When there are few options, we expect less. We accept what is available and feel grateful if it is good. But when there are many options, we expect to find exactly what we want, expect the perfect fit, and our standards rise. And this rising threshold means that good outcomes feel merely adequate rather than excellent. And satisfaction depends not on absolute quality, but on the gap between expectations and reality. And more choice raises expectations faster than it improves outcomes. And so, the net effect is decreased satisfaction, despite better products and more freedom. Visualize a graph with number of options on one axis and satisfaction on the other. And the relationship is not linear, but inverted U-shaped. Satisfaction rises as options increase from 0 to some moderate number, perhaps 5 or 10, because having some choice allows people to find something that fits their preferences. But beyond that optimal point, satisfaction begins to decline. And at very high numbers of options, satisfaction may even fall below the level experienced with minimal choice, because the cognitive and emotional costs of choosing exceed the benefits of additional options. And this inverted U captures the paradox, shows that more is not always better, that optimization requires moderation, that there is such a thing as too much freedom. The paradox has practical implications for product design, marketing, and policy. Companies that offer too many products may overwhelm customers and reduce sales, while companies that curate their offerings, that limit choice to a manageable set of high-quality options, may increase satisfaction and loyalty. And this is why successful brands often limit their product lines, why Apple offers relatively few models compared to competitors, why some restaurants have short menus. The limitation is not a failure, but a strategy, a recognition that customers benefit from being protected from too much choice, from having the decision space narrowed by experts who have already done the filtering. The paradox also affects personal life and well-being. Modern individuals face an unprecedented number of choices about identity, lifestyle, career, relationships, and consumption. And while this freedom is liberating in principle, in practice it can be exhausting, can create a sense of being overwhelmed, can generate anxiety about missing out on better options. And research shows that people in societies with more choice are not necessarily happier, that reported life satisfaction has not increased proportionally with the explosion of options, and some argue it has decreased, that the paradox of choice contributes to rising rates of anxiety and depression, that the burden of constructing a life from infinite options without clear guidance is a source of modern malaise. One response to the paradox is to adopt satisficing rather than maximizing as a decision strategy. Maximizers seek the best option, the optimal choice, and this requires evaluating all possibilities, comparing exhaustively, and the process is endless because there is always the possibility that a better option exists somewhere. While satisficers set a threshold of good enough and choose the first option that meets that threshold, and satisficers experience less stress, less regret, and higher satisfaction because they commit to good options without torturing themselves about whether better options exist. And embracing satisficing is a way to opt out of the paradox, to limit self-imposed choice burden even when external options are numerous. Another response is to establish routines and defaults, to make decisions once and then follow the decision automatically in the future, to reduce the number of active choices required. And this is why successful people often simplify their lives, wear the same clothes every day, eat the same breakfast, follow the same schedule, not because they lack creativity, but because they recognize that decision-making is a limited resource, that every choice consumes cognitive energy, and preserving that energy for important decisions requires eliminating trivial choices through routinization. A third response is to embrace constraints, to deliberately limit options, to refuse to consider all possibilities, and this might involve setting rules like, I only shop at this store, or I only consider jobs in this city. And these self-imposed constraints reduce the choice space, make decisions more manageable, and paradoxically increase freedom by preventing paralysis, by ensuring that decisions get made rather than deferred indefinitely. And constraints are not limitations on freedom, but conditions for effective exercise of freedom, structures that enable choice rather than preventing it. The shopper stands in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by options, and eventually walks away empty-handed or grabs something arbitrarily, and the experience is repeated across modern life, in career choices and relationship decisions and consumption patterns, and the paradox persists. More choice leading to less satisfaction, more freedom creating more anxiety. And Schwartz's insight remains relevant, challenges the ideology of unlimited choice, suggests that well-being requires moderation, requires protection from too much optionality, and the paradox endures as a reminder that freedom is complex, that having options is valuable, but that value has limits, that beyond a certain point additional options become burdens rather than benefits. And the challenge for individuals and societies is to find the optimal level of choice, the sweet spot where there is enough freedom to allow for genuine self-determination, but not so much that the burden of choosing overwhelms the benefit of having chosen. And the paradox remains a feature of modern affluent societies, a price paid for abundance, and a problem that requires not more choice but wiser choice, not more options but better frameworks for navigating options. And the cereal aisle waits, endless and overwhelming, and the shopper eventually learns to bring a list to decide in advance, to opt out of the paradox by refusing to treat every shopping trip as an opportunity for exhaustive optimization. The paradox of fiction: why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief, and yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred. And if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions, despite the audience knowing it is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy, and normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim, argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief, because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief, can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception, a mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real. And various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives, regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens, the film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist. And the tears are real, even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion and fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The paradox of tolerance, when being open-minded means destroying open-mindedness. A liberal society values tolerance, values the freedom to believe different things, to practice different religions, to hold different political views, to live in different ways. And this tolerance is seen as a virtue, as essential to freedom and democracy, as the foundation of peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. And the principle seems clear. We should tolerate all views and practices, should allow maximum freedom, should not suppress beliefs or ways of life just because we disagree with them. And yet a problem emerges, a paradox first articulated clearly by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, which asks what a tolerant society should do when faced with intolerance, when confronted by movements that reject tolerance itself. that seek to destroy the open society and replace it with authoritarianism, that demand the right to spread hate and silence opposition. And if the tolerant society tolerates these intolerant movements, if it grants them freedom to organize and spread their views, then the intolerant movements will eventually gain power and destroy tolerance itself, will shut down free speech, will persecute minorities, will end democracy, and the tolerant society will have tolerated itself out of existence. And this is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance, that to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to be intolerant toward intolerance, to refuse to tolerate those who would destroy tolerance. Imagine a democracy where free speech is protected, where all political views are allowed, where movements can organize and campaign and attempt to win power through elections. And now, imagine a fascist movement that explicitly rejects democracy, that promises to seize power and end elections and establish dictatorship. And this movement uses the freedoms of the democratic system to grow, uses free speech to spread propaganda, uses freedom of assembly to recruit followers, uses democratic procedures to gain seats in parliament, and at each stage the democratic society faces a choice. Do we tolerate this movement? Do we allow it to continue operating within the system, even though its goal is to destroy the system? Or do we suppress it? Do we ban the movement, arrest its leaders, prevent it from spreading its message? And if we suppress it, are we betraying our own principles? Are we becoming intolerant ourselves? And if we do not suppress it, are we complicit in our own destruction? Are we naive? Are we allowing democracy to commit suicide? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant, that tolerance is not a suicide pact, that a society that wishes to remain tolerant must be willing to defend itself against movements that seek to destroy tolerance, and this means that tolerance has limits, that it does not extend to those who would abuse it to eliminate tolerance. And Popper acknowledged that this is paradoxical, that the tolerant society must practice intolerance, must suppress certain views, must limit freedom in order to preserve freedom. But he argued that this is necessary, that the alternative is the death of tolerance, and history supports this. Societies that tolerated fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s saw those movements seize power and establish brutal dictatorships. And the lesson is that tolerance must be defended, that it cannot be absolute, that there are views and movements that cannot be accommodated within a free society because their goal is to end freedom. But this creates difficult questions about where to draw the line, about which views count as intolerably intolerant, about who decides, about what methods of suppression are legitimate. Because if we ban every movement that seems threatening, if we suppress every view that makes us uncomfortable, then we are no longer a tolerant society. We have become the oppressors. We have done the work of the intolerant for them. And so the paradox is not fully resolved by saying we should not tolerate intolerance, because we need principles to determine what counts as intolerance. What level of threat justifies suppression, and whether suppression means banning speech, banning organizations, arresting people, or merely refusing to engage, refusing to give platforms, refusing to treat intolerant views as legitimate options in public debate. Visualize a spectrum of intolerance. On one end are views that are merely offensive or unpopular, views that challenge prevailing norms, views that make some people uncomfortable. And these views, even if we find them objectionable, should be tolerated in a free society, should be allowed to be expressed and debated, because tolerance means accepting that people will hold views we dislike. And suppressing offensive views is censorship, is the tyranny of the majority, is the opposite of the tolerance we claim to value. And on the other end of the spectrum are movements that actively seek to destroy democratic institutions, that incite violence, that organize to strip rights from minorities, that threaten the basic conditions of a free society. And these movements, Popper argues, need not be tolerated, can be suppressed to protect the tolerant society, but the middle of the spectrum is murky, filled with cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a movement or view crosses the line. And this is where the paradox bites hardest, where we must make judgments without clear rules, where any decision risks either tolerating too much and allowing intolerance to grow, or suppressing too much and becoming intolerant ourselves. Some philosophers argue that the paradox can be resolved through procedural rules, through formal commitments to democratic processes. A tolerant society tolerates all views that accept the democratic framework, that agree to compete peacefully for power, that accept the results of elections and respect the rights of others, but it does not tolerate movements that reject these procedures, that seek power through violence or intimidation, that refuse to accept electoral defeat. And this procedural approach provides a clear line. Tolerance extends to those who play by the rules, not to those who seek to overturn the rules. But critics note that even this approach involves substantive value judgments, because the democratic framework itself embodies values like equality and freedom. And so we are saying we tolerate all views except those that reject our core values. And this is not neutral tolerance, but partisan tolerance, tolerance of a specific range of views that we have already deemed acceptable. Others argue that the solution involves distinguishing between tolerating views and tolerating actions, that a truly tolerant society allows people to hold and express any beliefs, but does not allow them to act on beliefs that harm others. So expressing racist views might be tolerated, but discriminatory actions are not. Advocating for dictatorship might be tolerated, but attempting a coup is not. And this distinction seems to preserve free thought and speech while preventing harm, but it faces difficulties because speech can cause harm, hate speech can incite violence, propaganda can radicalize people, and drawing the line between harmless expression and harmful action is not straightforward. And some argue that by the time intolerant movements act, it may be too late, that tolerant societies must suppress intolerant speech before it metastasizes into intolerant action. The paradox also has a psychological dimension, because tolerating intolerance is emotionally difficult, requires accepting that people will spread views you find abhorrent, will organize against values you hold dear, will seek to undermine the society you want to preserve. And this acceptance is painful, creates tension, and there is a constant temptation to suppress, to silence, to refuse to tolerate, and distinguishing between legitimate suppression of genuine threats and illegitimate censorship of mere disagreement requires judgment, requires resisting the urge to label all opposing views as intolerable, requires humility about our own fallibility. And these are difficult virtues to maintain, especially in polarized times when every political disagreement feels existential. The tolerant society stands at the edge, welcoming diverse views, protecting freedom, and watching as intolerant movements test the boundaries, push the limits, demand the right to destroy the very system that protects them. And the society must decide, must draw a line, must say some things cannot be tolerated, some movements cannot be accommodated. And in drawing that line, the society becomes less than perfectly tolerant, accepts that tolerance has limits, that the open society must defend itself. And the paradox does not disappear, but is managed, lived with, navigated through judgment and vigilance. And Popper's warning echoes, unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, and so tolerance must be limited, must exclude those who would destroy it. And this is not a betrayal of tolerance, but its preservation. Not a contradiction, but a recognition that all principles have boundaries, that values must be defended, and that the truly tolerant society is one that tolerates everything except intolerance. And the paradox remains uncomfortable and unresolved, a permanent feature of liberal democracy, a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be actively maintained, and that tolerance for all its virtues is not enough by itself, must be supplemented with vigilance, with judgment, with the willingness to say no, to draw lines, to defend the open society against those who would close it, and the tension persists, always present, always requiring balance, and the paradox endures. The 5 phenomenon, why motion is an illusion your brain creates. 2 lights flash in sequence. First, one light turns on and off. Then a moment later, another light nearby turns on and off. And yet what you perceive is not 2 separate flashes, but a single light moving from the first position to the second. Continuous motion where there is none. Smooth travel through space that never occurred. And this is the 5 phenomenon, discovered by Max Wertheimer in 1912. A fundamental illusion that reveals how the brain constructs the perception of motion, shows that motion is not simply detected from sensory input, but is created, is synthesized by the visual system from discrete static images. And the 5 phenomenon is the principle behind movies and television, where still frames flashed rapidly create the illusion of continuous motion, where characters seem to move smoothly when they are really just a sequence of frozen images. An understanding fee reveals that all motion perception involves construction, involves the brain interpreting changes and inferring movement. And motion is not a basic sensory property, but is a higher level interpretation. A perceptual inference that usually corresponds to reality, but can be fooled, can be triggered by appropriate sequences, even when nothing actually moves. And the 5 phenomenon stands as evidence that perception is actively constructed rather than passively recorded. That what we see is not simply what is there, but is what the brain interprets as being there. Imagine the experimental setup. 2 dots on a screen, separated by some distance, and the first dot appears briefly, vanishes. Then after a short delay, the second dot appears, and if the timing and spacing are right, you do not see 2 sequential flashes, but see 1 dot moving from the first position to the second, sliding smoothly across the space between them. And this apparent motion, this phi, is so compelling that it feels exactly like real motion, indistinguishable phenomenologically from watching an object actually travel through space. And yet nothing moved. No object traversed the gap. There were only 2 separate stationary flashes, and the motion exists only in your perception, is constructed by your brain from the temporal sequence. The 5 phenomenon reveals that the visual system assumes continuity, assumes that when similar stimuli appear in nearby locations in rapid succession, they are probably the same object in motion. And this assumption is usually correct, is how motion in the real world works. Objects move continuously from place to place, and perceiving them as moving requires detecting this spatio-temporal pattern, and the visual system has evolved to detect this pattern efficiently, to infer motion from sequences of static retinal images, and phi exploits this mechanism, presents the pattern without the actual motion, and the brain responds as it normally does, constructs motion perception, and the illusion demonstrates that motion is not directly given in sensation, but is computed from changes in position over time. Visualize motion perception as involving motion detectors, neurons that respond to changes in position, to objects moving across the visual field, and these detectors can be activated by real motion or by appropriate sequences of static stimuli. And phi activates these detectors, creates the neural signature of motion without actual motion. And the brain cannot distinguish between motion signals caused by real movement and motion signals caused by phi sequences. And so phi creates genuine motion perception, creates the subjective experience of seeing something move. And this shows that motion perception is a neural state that can be produced by different causes, by real motion or by well-timed sequences. And the experience is the same, regardless of cause. The phi phenomenon differs from other apparent motion phenomena, differs from beta motion, which is pure displacement without phenomenal movement, differs from stroboscopic motion, which is the specific type of motion seen in films, and phi is the perception of smooth, continuous movement, is the most compelling type of apparent motion. Most closely resembles real motion, and understanding the distinctions between different types of apparent motion reveals the complexity of the motion perception system. Reveals that there are multiple mechanisms, multiple ways the brain computes motion, and phi is one specific mechanism, the mechanism that creates smooth motion perception from discrete temporal sequences. Gestalt psychologists like Wertheimer used phi to argue against elementalist theories of perception, against theories that said perception is built up from simple sensations combined according to associations, and phi shows that perception is not a sum of elements, not a combination of two flashes, but is a holistic interpretation, is motion that emerges from the relationship between flashes, and the whole is different from the sum of parts. And this Gestalt insight-shaped psychology influenced how perception came to be understood as involving organization and interpretation rather than simple sensation. And phi became a canonical example, a demonstration that perception is constructive, is synthetic, creates experiences that go beyond the sensory input. The phi phenomenon also has philosophical implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you experience in phi is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion, and yet no motion occurred in the stimulus. And this raises questions about the relationship between experience and reality, about whether experiences are always caused by corresponding physical events. And phi shows they are not, shows that the same experience can be caused by different physical processes, by real motion, or by sequential flashes. And this supports functionalist theories of consciousness, supports the view that conscious experiences are not tied to specific physical substrates, but are computational states that can be realized in multiple ways. One implication of phi for film and animation is that smooth motion can be created with relatively low frame rates. As long as frames are spaced appropriately in time and space, the phi phenomenon will create smooth motion perception. And this is why movies work at 24 frames per second, why television works at similar rates. The temporal gaps between frames are short enough that phi fills them in, creates continuous motion, and filmmakers exploit phi to create realistic movement, to make still images come alive. And understanding phi has been crucial to developing motion picture technology, to optimizing frame rates and timing. Another implication concerns perceptual boundaries, concerns what counts as seeing motion versus what counts as inferring motion, because phi feels like seeing motion, feels like direct perception, not like making an inference or having a belief. And yet phi is constructed, is synthesized by the brain from discrete inputs, and this raises questions about where perception ends and cognition begins, whether the boundary is sharp or gradual, whether there are clear distinctions between seeing and thinking, or whether perception shades continuously into cognition. And phi sits on this boundary, is simultaneously perceptual, immediate, and phenomenologically direct and cognitive, involving complex processing and interpretation. The lights flash in sequence and motion appears, smooth travel from first to second, and nothing moved, only the brain moved from sensing to interpreting, from input to output. And phi emerges, motion created from stillness, continuity created from discontinuity. And the phenomenon reveals the constructive nature of perception, reveals that experience is not a mirror of reality, but is a model constructed by the brain, a model that usually tracks reality accurately, but can be manipulated, can be triggered by artificial sequences. And the phi phenomenon endures as one of the foundational discoveries in perceptual psychology, a demonstration that motion is not given but is made, is not detected but is computed, and every motion you see, real or apparent, involves this same computation, this same construction. And phi makes the construction explicit, shows that what seems most immediate, most directly perceived, is actually mediated, is processed, is inferred, and motion is an illusion, A useful, accurate illusion, usually, but an illusion nonetheless. And Phi reveals this and the lights flash on. The paradox of value, why what we need most costs least. An economist contemplates the nature of value, asks what makes things valuable, what determines worth, and observes a fundamental puzzle that prices seem disconnected from importance, that markets assign high prices to luxuries and low prices to necessities, that goods essential for human flourishing cost little while goods that serve vanity or status cost fortunes. And this is the paradox of value, the broader version of the diamond water paradox, the puzzle that spans across all goods and services. And the paradox asks why healthcare is expensive, while entertainment is cheap in some places and the reverse in others. Why teachers are paid less than entertainers. Why life-saving drugs are affordable in some markets and unaffordable in others. Why the allocation of value by markets seems misaligned with human needs, with moral worth, with social importance. And this paradox has troubled economic thinking since ancient times, has been discussed by philosophers from Aristotle to Marx. And while modern economics offers explanations through supply and demand, through marginal utility, through market equilibrium, the paradox retains moral force, retains the sense that something is wrong, that prices should reflect importance, that markets fail to value correctly, and the paradox of value remains a central challenge for defending market allocation, for justifying price mechanisms, for explaining why efficient markets can produce what seem like perverse valuations. Imagine comparing different goods by their importance to human welfare. And air is essential, sustains life, is necessary for survival, cannot be done without for more than minutes. And yet air is free, has zero price, costs nothing. While gold is non-essential, serves no biological function, is desired only for decoration or a store of value. And yet gold is expensive, costs thousands per ounce, and this comparison illustrates the paradox, shows that necessity and price are inversely related, that the most needed goods are often cheapest and the least needed goods often expensive. And this pattern extends across many goods. Water is cheap, housing varies but is often expensive, healthcare is expensive in many places, education costs are rising, food prices are moderate, while luxuries like jewellery, sports cars, yachts, artwork, all command premium prices. And the pattern suggests that markets value incorrectly, value luxury over necessity, value status over survival. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that market allocation is unjust, is misaligned with human values. The paradox of value demonstrates the tension between exchange value, what markets assign, and use value, what humans need. And Marx emphasized this distinction, argued that capitalism systematically undervalues use value, undervalues goods necessary for life, while overvaluing exchange value, overvaluing goods that serve accumulation. And this misalignment is not accidental, but is structural, is inherent in market systems that allocate based on willingness to pay rather than on need. And those with money can bid up prices of luxuries, while those without cannot bid up prices of necessities. And markets respond to money, not to need. And this explains the paradox. It explains why diamonds are expensive and water cheap. Because those who want diamonds have money to pay high prices, while those who need water cannot afford high prices. And markets clear at prices that balance supply and demand among those with purchasing power, not among all humans with needs. Visualize the paradox as revealing different concepts of value, economic value, defined by market prices determined by supply and demand, and purchasing power, and moral or social value, defined by importance to human welfare, determined by needs and flourishing. And these two concepts diverge, are not aligned. And economic value is amoral, is neutral about what should be valued, reflects only what is valued by those with money to spend, while moral value judges that some goods are more important than others, that necessities matter more than luxuries, that human needs should be prioritized, And the paradox is the gap between these concepts, is the recognition that markets do not track moral value, do not allocate according to importance. And this gap creates the sense that markets are unjust, are inadequate for distributing goods that matter most. One response to the paradox of value is that markets are efficient, are good at allocating resources to maximize satisfaction of preferences weighted by willingness to pay. And while this may not align with moral importance, it is the best available system, is better than alternatives, like central planning, which face information problems and incentive problems. And markets at least respond to decentralized information about preferences, at least allow individuals to make choices, and efficiency does not require tracking moral importance, requires only that resources go to those who value them most as measured by willingness to pay. And this response accepts the paradox, accepts that markets do not and should not track moral value, argues that moral allocation should be achieved through other means, through taxation and redistribution, through public provision of essential goods, through regulation that ensures access to necessities, and markets should be left to allocate efficiently while other institutions address moral concerns. Another response questions whether the paradox is real, argues that necessities actually are valuable, are provided at low cost because markets are efficient at producing them, because competition drives prices down, and the reason necessities are cheap is that we have solved the production problem, have made them abundant, and abundance is good, is the goal. And the paradox mistakes low price for low value, confuses market price with social importance. And in fact, low prices for necessities mean high consumer surplus, mean people benefit greatly from access to cheap necessities. And this is success, not failure. Is markets working well? Not markets failing. And the paradox dissolves once we recognize that low prices for necessities reflect abundance and efficiency rather than lack of value, and high prices for luxuries reflect scarcity and inefficiency rather than high value. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that markets misallocate, argues that essential goods should not be left to markets, should be provided through public systems, through universal healthcare, through public education, through subsidized housing, and markets can allocate luxuries, can determine who gets diamonds and yachts. But necessities are different, require different allocation mechanisms, require ensuring universal access regardless of ability to pay. And this social democratic response uses the paradox to argue for limits on markets, for sectors where market allocation is inappropriate, where public provision is necessary, and the paradox becomes an argument for mixed economies, for market allocation in some domains and public allocation in others. The paradox also appears in labour markets, where compensation seems misaligned with social importance, and teachers are paid less than entertainers, nurses less than financiers, social workers less than lawyers, and this pattern suggests that markets undervalue socially important work, undervalue contributions to welfare and education and care, while overvaluing contributions to entertainment and finance. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that labour markets are unjust, and explaining the pattern requires understanding supply and demand for labour, requires recognising that compensation reflects scarcity and productivity as measured by market value, not social importance, and teachers are abundant relative to demand while CEOs are scarce, and market productivity of CEOs as measured by profit contribution exceeds that of teachers. And these factors determine compensation, not social importance. And this explains the pattern but does not eliminate the moral concern, does not resolve the sense that something is wrong with a system that pays entertainers more than educators. Some argue that the paradox of value reveals limits of price as measure of value, reveals that not everything important can be priced, that some goods resist commodification, that markets are appropriate for some goods and inappropriate for others, and market prices are useful for allocating produced commodities, but are inadequate for allocating access to health, education, safety, justice, and these latter goods require different allocation mechanisms, require treating them as rights or entitlements rather than as commodities to be purchased. And the paradox supports this view, supports the idea that markets have limits, that not everything should be for sale, that some forms of value resist market logic. The necessities remain cheap, the luxuries remain expensive, and the paradox persists. Prices diverge from importance, exchange value diverges from use value, markets allocate without regard to need, and the pattern continues, and the paradox of value endures as a permanent feature of market systems, endures as a moral challenge to market allocation, and resolving the tension requires either accepting that markets are amoral, are efficient but not just, and supplementing markets with institutions that ensure access to necessities, or rejecting markets for essential goods, replacing market allocation with public provision. And the paradox remains unresolved and troubling, showing that what we need most costs least, that prices do not track importance, that markets value incorrectly from a moral perspective, even if correctly from an economic perspective, and the paradox endures. The paradox of power. Why having power makes you lose it. A leader gains power through competence, through understanding others' needs, through empathy and social intelligence, through building coalitions and reading situations accurately. And these qualities enable the rise to power, enable winning support, enable navigating social hierarchies, and the leader reaches positions of authority, gains control over resources, gains ability to make decisions affecting others, and then something changes. The experience of having power alters the psychology of the powerful, reduces empathy, reduces perspective-taking, increases confidence, increases risk-taking, and these changes are the opposite of what brought power, are the erosion of the very qualities that enabled gaining power. And this is the paradox of power, described by psychologist Daché Keltner and others. The finding that power changes people, makes them less attuned to others, less socially intelligent, less effective at the behaviours that won them power, and powerful people become entitled, become overconfident, become less accurate in reading social situations. And these changes lead to misuse of power, lead to decisions that harm subordinates, lead to loss of support, and eventually lead to loss of power itself. And the paradox shows that power contains the seeds of its own destruction, that having power undermines the qualities necessary to maintain power. And this cycle explains the rise and fall of leaders, explains why initial competence gives way to corruption or incompetence, explains why power corrupts. And the paradox has implications for understanding leadership, for recognizing that power is dangerous, that maintaining power requires deliberate effort to preserve the qualities that win power, requires resistance to the psychological effects of having power. Imagine the psychological changes that occur when someone gains power, gains control, gains authority, and research shows that power activates the behavioral approach system, increases focus on rewards, increases willingness to take risks, and simultaneously, power deactivates the behavioral inhibition system, reduces attention to threats, reduces concern about others' reactions, and these changes make powerful people more action-oriented, more decisive, but also less careful, less considerate. And experiments demonstrate this, show that people primed to feel powerful are more likely to interrupt others, to speak out of turn, to violate social norms, to take what they want without considering others, and powerful people literally see less, attend less to others' emotions, are worse at identifying facial expressions, are less accurate in reading social cues. And this reduced social intelligence is ironic because social intelligence is what typically wins power, is what enables navigating social hierarchies, and power reduces the very capacity that was necessary to gain it. The paradox of power demonstrates that power is self-undermining, that the experience of having power changes people in ways that make them worse at wielding power, that the psychological effects of power include overconfidence, reduced empathy, increased risk-taking, reduced constraint, and these effects lead to mistakes, lead to alienating subordinates, lead to poor decisions, and eventually lead to loss of power. And the cycle repeats. New leaders rise through empathy and social intelligence, gain power, lose these qualities, make mistakes, lose power. And the paradox is that the qualities needed to gain power are different from or opposite to the psychological effects of having power. And this mismatch drives the cycle, drives the rise and fall of leaders. And preventing the cycle requires awareness, requires powerful people to recognize the psychological effects of power and deliberately compensate, deliberately maintain empathy, deliberately attend to others, deliberately resist the natural effects of power. Visualize the paradox as a feedback loop. Gaining power reduces empathy. Reduced empathy leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions alienate supporters. Alienated supporters withdraw support. Withdrawn support leads to loss of power, and the loop is negative, is self-reinforcing, is a cycle that drives powerful people toward downfall. And breaking the loop requires intervention, requires powerful people to resist the psychological effects of power, requires institutional checks that constrain power, requires cultures that maintain accountability, and without such mechanisms, the loop runs its course. Power leads to its own destruction, and the paradox unfolds. One mechanism underlying the paradox is the disinhibition effect, the finding that power reduces inhibition, reduces self-regulation, reduces the internal constraints that normally prevent people from acting on impulses, and powerful people feel freer to do what they want. Feel less constrained by social norms, feel less concerned about consequences, and this freedom can be positive, can enable decisive action, can overcome excessive caution, but it also leads to inappropriate behavior, leads to violations of norms, leads to taking advantage of others, and the disinhibition effect explains many abuses of power, explains why powerful people harass subordinates, why they take liberties, why they feel entitled, and the effect is not intentional. Malice, but is psychological change caused by having power, is reduced inhibition that allows latent tendencies to manifest. Another mechanism is the decreased perspective taking, the finding that power reduces the ability and motivation to understand others' perspectives, to imagine how situations look from others' viewpoints, and powerful people focus on their own goals, their own needs, and pay less attention to others. And this reduced perspective taking makes powerful people worse at negotiation, worse at building consensus, worse at understanding how their actions affect others, and these deficits undermine effectiveness, undermine leadership, and create the conditions for losing power. And the paradox is complete. Power reduces the social intelligence needed to maintain power. One response to the paradox is institutional design, creating checks on power, creating accountability mechanisms, creating regular reviews or elections that force powerful people to maintain support. And democratic systems embody this, have regular elections that remove leaders who lose support, and corporate boards have review processes. And these institutions mitigate the paradox by making power conditional, by requiring continued demonstration of competence, by preventing the complacency that power breeds. And effective institutions recognize the paradox, recognize that power corrupts, and design around it, create structures that limit the damage caused by the psychological effects of power. Another response is leadership development, training leaders to recognize the paradox, to understand the psychological effects of power, to deliberately maintain empathy and perspective taking. And research shows that awareness helps, that leaders who understand the paradox are better at resisting its effects, are more likely to maintain the qualities that won them power. And leadership training increasingly includes content about the psychology of power, about the importance of humility, about the need to deliberately attend to others despite the psychological pull towards self-focus. And this training aims to break the cycle, aims to help powerful people resist the natural effects of power. A third response is cultural, creating organizational cultures that value empathy, that reward perspective-taking, that punish abuse of power. And some organizations succeed at this, create environments where power does not corrupt, where leaders remain accountable, remain connected to subordinates. And these cultures require work, require deliberate effort to maintain, require norms that constrain power, that make abuse costly, and they require exemplars, require leaders who model healthy use of power, who demonstrate that power can be wielded without corruption. And these cultural interventions show that the paradox is not inevitable, is not deterministic, but can be managed through collective effort. The paradox also connects to ancient wisdom, to the recognition across cultures and eras that power corrupts, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that leaders must guard against the temptations of power. And philosophers from Plato to Confucius recognized the paradox, recognized that power changes people, and their advice remains relevant, remains a warning that power is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, that humility is essential, and the paradox of power shows that this ancient wisdom is psychologically accurate, is confirmed by modern research, is not merely moral preaching, but is description of how power actually affects people. The leader rises, gains authority, controls resources, makes decisions, and power begins its work, reduces empathy, increases overconfidence, loosens inhibitions, and the leader becomes less effective, less attuned, more self-focused, makes mistakes, alienates supporters, and the fall begins, and the paradox completes its arc. Power undermines itself. The qualities that won power are lost, and new leaders rise to repeat the cycle, and the paradox of power endures as a permanent feature of leadership, as a psychological reality that must be managed, that must be resisted, that must be constrained through institutions and culture and awareness. And the paradox remains inevitable and destructive unless deliberately countered, unless powerful people recognize the effects and fight them, unless societies build structures that limit the damage and the cycle continues. The rise and fall driven by the paradox that having power undermines the ability to keep it. The paradox of the ravens, yet another formulation of Hempel's problem. The paradox appears under multiple names because different philosophers have formulated it independently or emphasized different aspects. And the paradox of the ravens is essentially identical to the paradox of confirmation and to the raven paradox, all referring to Hempel's discovery that observing non-black non-ravens logically confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And this formulation emphasizes the ravens themselves, emphasizes that the hypothesis is about a specific class of objects, ravens, and yet evidence can come from observing completely different objects, apples and shoes and clouds, and the paradoxical nature lies in this disconnect between what the hypothesis is about and what confirms it, between the subject matter and the evidence, and calling it the paradox of the ravens highlights this strange relationship, makes explicit that ravens are the subject of the hypothesis, but need not be the subject of confirming observations. The multiplicity of names reflects the paradox's importance, its centrality to philosophy of science, because a problem this fundamental is rediscovered repeatedly, is approached from different angles, and each formulation brings slightly different emphasis, highlights different aspects of the puzzle, and some formulations focus on confirmation theory, on the formal logic of evidence, while others focus on scientific practice, on what scientists actually do when testing hypotheses, and still others focus on intuitions, on the clash between logical conclusions and common sense judgments. And all these perspectives are valuable, all contribute to understanding the paradox, and the proliferation of names is a sign of the paradox's richness. Its ability to raise questions at multiple levels, from technical issues in confirmation theory to broad questions about scientific method. The paradox also connects to debates about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to statistics and inference, because Bayesians have a ready answer to the paradox, can explain using Bayes' theorem why red apples confirm that all ravens are black, but provide only negligible confirmation, while frequentists struggle more, find it harder to explain the asymmetry between observing ravens and observing non-ravens. And this has led some philosophers to see the raven paradox as evidence for Bayesianism, as showing that Bayesian methods are better equipped to handle confirmation than classical approaches, though others argue that the paradox is not decisive, that various approaches can accommodate it with appropriate modifications. The paradox remains a standard topic in philosophy curricula, a problem that every student encounters. And despite its age, despite being formulated in the 1940s, it continues to generate discussion, continues to appear in new papers and books, because it is simple enough to explain quickly, deep enough to sustain extended analysis, and challenging enough that no solution is universally accepted. And this combination makes it pedagogically valuable and philosophically important, a paradox that serves both as an introduction to philosophy of science and as a topic for advanced research. The ravens circle overhead, black against the sky, and each sighting confirms what we already believed, that ravens are black, and elsewhere apples sit in bowls, red and green and yellow, and logic says these two are evidence about ravens, and the paradox persists, a permanent feature of confirmation theory, a problem that every account of scientific reasoning must address. And the paradox endures under its many names, always the same underlying puzzle, always the same challenge to explain how evidence works, what confirms hypotheses, and why common sense and formal logic sometimes diverge. And the paradox of the ravens remains, waiting for each new generation of philosophers to confront it, to propose solutions, to argue about confirmation, and to recognize that even basic concepts in science conceal philosophical depths that resist easy resolution.